So incredible, so I should fear to describe, except that conscience, being pure in this, encourages me to tell. I saw, and writing it now, my brain still envisions a headless trunk that walked in sad promenade, shuffling the dolorous track with its companions, and the trunk was carrying the severed head, gripping its hair like a lantern, so the headless horseman. All of that stuff is derived now in large measure from this one scene of Bertrand de Born. He dies in 1215. He's a monk who inspired a rebellion, and yet the most gripping thing about him is he carries his head around like a lantern, and the head will talk, letting it swing, and the head looked up at us. "Oh, me," it cried. He was himself and his lamp as he strode along, 2 in 1 and 1 in 2. And how it can be, only he knows. Whoso ordains the thing, only God knows how this could work out. Reaching the bridge, the trunk held the head up high so we could hear his words, which were, "Look well, you who come breathing to view the dead, and say if there is punishment harder than mine in hell. Carry the word, and know me, Bertrand de Born, who made the father and son rebel, the one against the other." Here it's King Henry II versus his son Prince Henry, the young king. "The one against the other, by the evil turn I did the young king, counseling him to ill. David and Absalom," the story, of course, of the Old Testament, where Absalom rises up against David and for it ultimately dies, "had nothing worse to learn from the wickedness contrived by Achitophel," the counselor to Absalom, that told him, "You should do this. Because I parted their union, I carry my brain parted from this, its pitiful stem. Mark well, this retribution that you see is mine." Now, one of the things I love about Pinsky's translation is it allows us to jump over the page. Do you see across the page on 242? Do you see the last word, contrapassio? That contrapassio is the word retribution. This sin is somehow reenacted. And again, this idea coming heavily from Thomas Aquinas' notion of what hell is really like. The sin is reenacted. So, for example, fomenters of schism are cut apart. You see it? You understand how that one works? In other words, if in your life you tear people apart, in your death in hell, you are severed. You're cut apart by the sword. Well, that's some pretty disturbing stuff. Let's jump to level 2 and 3 really quickly. Obviously, at level 2, one of the major messages of this canto is disharmony leads to political ruin. Think about what we said already in Plato's Republic, right? The idea, remember that we said, the reason why groups form and come together and then ascend is harmony. And therefore, on the other side of that little hill that we created so many times in our study, disharmony is what leads ultimately to all the catastrophes historically, politically. That is to say, another message, to tear others down is ultimately to cut or to wound or to sever your own soul. Finally, of course, Dante saw a world with only one religion leading the way, right? Of course, today, we obviously have a different understanding. I say we, many of us have a different understanding of what we really are hoping for, religious peace and toleration. That is to say, we have to find some way for all of the religions on the planet to cohabitate. If we don't, then obviously we got a different understanding of schism. That is to say, world war of a kind, right? And that's horrific. We're often reminded of how terrible that is. And to be the symbolism here, as we said at Contrapassio, that idea that you cut up groups, you sever groups, and for that you yourself get cut up. We've seen this kind of example in many, many ways throughout Inferno, right? That idea that what you do in life comes back to haunt you in some similar or counter way. Like, for example, if you speak poop in life, you swallow poop in afterlife. The ironies, and there are many of them in this canto, but let's just concentrate on this one. Notice, the irony is that Dante continues to kind of pepper and salt the Guelph-Ghibelline conflict, right? By the way he speaks. There is absolutely no tolerance here. And as we get on into the Divine Comedy, Dante will slowly begin to realize that there will never be peace between people without some understanding of love and forgiveness. He'll get to that. It just doesn't happen in Inferno. Well, there's no question that when we're speaking about Dante, the poet here, this is some of the most grotesque and graphic stuff in all of Inferno. Dante the politician, no question, he again will come back to why it is that Florence is so messed up, is this Guelph Ghibelline kind of thing. And finally, Dante the philosopher is going to make the observation here, as we've seen philosopher, theologian, that religious dissonance all really comes back to a misunderstanding and a misreading and a misapplication of Christian theology. In other words, in Dante's world, everyone should have the same Christian view. Of course, there's a few Jews that would point out for Dante that before Christianity became Christianity, it was, of course, Jewish. Jesus Christ was a Jew all of his life, right? And note, of course, the interesting kind of continuation with the monotheisms. We'll ask that question here in a second at 3b. At 3a, the deep-rooted, think about this, from our study of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, there's a deep-rooted hatred or suspicion of the other, right? Greeks hate Trojans, Trojans hate Greeks, right? Trojans in the Aeneid hate Latians, and Latians, of course, following Turnus, hate Trojans, right? There's that inability to appreciate the other at all. The fighting as well is even between the gods. Think about Hera and Aphrodite's disgust and loathing for each other. Or we might even say Hera's and Zeus's loathing for each other, right? What is your favorite text of horror? I know that's kind of a strange question, but it seems to me that we got a lot of interesting kinds of referencing of horror here and mutilations and the like. What is it for you that's the most interesting text? The 20th century, and at the end of the 20th century and then the 21st century, has seen a rise of these kind of horror texts. Some students will say, after I've read this though, man, I can see the genesis of a lot of that. It's attractive and it's scary. Stephen King, of course, has said the reason he was able to sell so many of his books of horror is the same reason that when many people drive by a wreck, they can't help but want to look. It's kind of grotesque, and yet you want to see it type of thing. Finally, at 3b, well, we're talking about schism and schismatics, so let's ask this question. When was a time that you created a split? That is to say, you created somehow dissension. And how did that work out? And what was the roots of that? What was the time that you helped to stop this kind of split or schism? Finally, this question, do you believe that we can have religious peace and tolerance between especially the monotheisms? The very fact that the word mono gets used in that appellation of monotheisms. Houston Smith has had a lot to say about this in his Religions of the World. I very much recommend that book to you. And as well, his attempt to try to explain the ways in which, if we understand different religious perspectives, we might be able to appreciate and tolerate, even though we don't necessarily agree, right? This kind of thing where we're putting a gutted Muhammad in hell obviously can only lead to greater intolerance, no question about that. Right? Of course, Dante will have jacked Caiaphas already in hell, laying on the ground crucified, and now here Muhammad gutted. This obviously is not going to render a real positive kind of view of the monotheisms between each other. Right? Well, that's Canto 28. We now turn to Canto 29 and 30. This will be the last pouch of the 8th circle. And we're going to get the falsifiers here, okay? And again, we're going to come back with some pretty interesting kinds of grotesque stuff happening, right? Dante in his full horror form, right? Thank you. I hope to see you back again.